Today, we will touch upon modules 4 and 5 of our summer school. Both of them are crucial to understanding the political positions of nuclear weapon states, countries under nuclear deterrence doctrines, and non-nuclear weapon states, as well as the legal framework related to nuclear weapons. So without any further delay, please allow me to briefly present our two panelists for Module 4, Motivation for Nuclear Weapons Acquisitions and Non-Acquisition. After doing so, I will kindly request them to start their presentations back to back. And after that, we will have a space for Q&A. Dr. Philipp Bleek is a fellow at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies and an associate professor at the Middlebury Institute for International Studies. He works on the causes, consequences, and amelioration of chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear weapons threats at the intersection of academia, non-governmental organizations, and government. He served as senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear, Chemical, and Biological Defense Programs. Also, he has served as an advisor to several political campaigns and consultant to the US government and non-governmental organizations, and regularly participate in Track 2 dialogues. Also, we have Mr. Jan Dupré, who you already know. He's the Senior Program Manager for Education and Training at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies. And he has more than 30 years of experience in diplomacy, international security, arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament. After a long diplomatic career in the South African Foreign Service, he joined CNS in 2002. In 2009, he was recruited by the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization in Vienna, where he led External Relations and International Cooperation section until August 2016. Well, please, we'll start now. I'll give the floor to you, Dr. Philipp Bleek, to start with your presentation. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It's lovely to be here with you. I do have slides. Right now, the host has disabled screen sharing, so I can't share them with you. But as soon as you're able to fix that, I'm happy to pull them up. But why don't I start while you do that? I'm guessing that will be pretty easy, and maybe just let me know. Are we good to screen share? Let me try again.
Yes, I'm ready.
Perfect. There we go. All right. Well, if you cannot see my screen, let me know, but otherwise I'm going to assume that you can. So again, I'm Philipp Bleek. I'm one of the professors in our Non-Proliferation and Terrorism Studies master's program. Just so you have a brief sense of my background, I have a PhD in political science. So I don't have a technical background, but I do have a lot of interest in technical issues. And I work on a broad range of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons issues, as the introduction suggested, at the intersection of academia, government, and non-governmental organizations. If you're interested in more info about me, there's a professional bio and lots of publications and other things at the link that you see on your screen. And I'm assuming that you will get the slides or a recording of this afterwards, so you'll have the ability to go back and reference it. So here's a quick agenda for what I want to talk to you for about the next 40 minutes about. So I'm going to kind of set the stage and just get you to think a little bit about what your own personal theory of nuclear weapons proliferation is. In other words, what your theory or model for why states pursue nuclear weapons, and also, just as importantly, why they don't is, and what policy implications follow from that, because how you think about nuclear proliferation has huge implications for how you think about preventing nuclear proliferation. I want to give you kind of one answer drawn from the academic literature, an attempt at a broad comprehensive answer, and then I want to systematically unpack how that literature thinks about the question, or what insights it has about the question of why states do and don't pursue nuclear weapons. I'll flag some potential complications briefly, and then I want to circle back to the question of what the implications are of those different arguments for efforts to prevent nuclear proliferation. You're welcome to put questions into the chat. I know, so I have quite a bit of content, so I'm going to be skimming over some things a little bit and diving into other things more deeply, but sporadically I'll look back at the chat and see if anyone has added anything there. I'm assuming that you have access to it. I'm not certain how this is set up as a webinar or a regular Zoom. So diving right in. Yes.
Philip, sorry to interrupt. So the participants will post in the Q&A box their questions.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect. So I'll try to glance at that occasionally and draw in a little bit of that and also not get too derailed. My students know that I love tangents. But given the time constraints, I'll try to stay focused on the core content. So just to start, I want you to imagine yourself on detail to the International Atomic Energy Agency. And I want you to imagine that you have just been tasked to do a nuclear proliferation risk assessment for Saudi Arabia. So you are in an intelligence capacity at the IAEA, and you've been asked to write a document that will help others at the IAEA think about the risks that Saudi Arabia might pursue nuclear weapons in future. And I want you to notice what comes up for you. And we're not going to do this as a class discussion, but I just want you to notice what right away do you think of as the crucial factors that you're going to highlight in your memo? What are the conditions under which you're going to tell other people to be more or less concerned about Saudi Arabian proliferation? For example, maybe right away you're thinking, the Saudi Arabian relationship with Iran is probably really crucial. How insecure Saudi Arabia feels relative to Iran, whether Iran has an active nuclear weapons program or whether that program is constrained or eliminated in part by other international actors. Maybe you're thinking, internal political dynamics in Saudi Arabia matter a lot, right? The power dynamics, how powerful MBS is and how powerful other people are and how secure or insecure they feel, right? So right away, you're thinking of a whole bunch of things. And one thing I want to push you not to think is it's complicated, everything matters. That is true. Everything matters. What MBS had for breakfast today has a very, 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 very slight impact on whether Saudi Arabia will end up someday getting nuclear weapons, perhaps. But what I want you to try to do is think about, for you, what's essential, right? If you could only know a couple things about Saudi Arabia, what would they be? And its relationship with Iran might be one of them. Its alliance relationship with the United States might be one of them. Its conventional military capabilities might be one of them. But just notice the things that for you are essential. And then what we're going to do today is I'm going to tell you what some other people think is essential, right? What they think are the essential things that either increase or decrease the risk that Saudi Arabia pursues nuclear weapons. And a closely related question is what we should do about it to make it less likely, or maybe even less likely if you don't think that it's very likely to start with, because the reasons why Saudi Arabia might proliferate or not proliferate are obviously intuitively, intimately linked to the things that we might do to make it less likely. To give you a simple example, if Saudi Arabian insecurity in a military sense is fundamental, there are things that we, speaking for the United States, can do to make them feel more secure, right? So that is a very intuitive linkage. If we provide them some degree of alliance, or if there's some degree, or even some actual tangible military capabilities, as the United States does, maybe that makes it less likely to proliferate. But that one's complicated too. Maybe it's the other way around, right? Maybe our support actually provides them with a kind of umbrella under which they can proliferate. So lots of nuances here. So here's one answer from the academic literature. So a couple years ago, two scholars, Debs and Monteiro, published a book in 2016, and I think an article in 2014, where they tried to answer broadly this question of what makes states likely to proliferate or not proliferate. And I have the full citation for you at the end of the talk in the slides if you're interested in it. They come from both a rationalist and a realist perspective. So they have a particular view of international politics that is not shared by everyone who analyzes international politics. In fact, it's not shared by lots of people, but that's their starting point. So their answer, such as it is governments that feel insecure may pursue and obtain nuclear weapons if they don't have good alternatives to doing that, and if they have the capability to do so. Now, maybe that feels like a great answer to you, and maybe that feels really wishy-washy, like you could sort of massage it to fit sort of almost any case that you wanted it to. What I want to flag for you is, however good you think that answer is, I would argue it raises at least as many questions as it answers, such as government. Like, what do we even mean by that, right? We're talking about institutions that have wildly different characters, right? In some cases, something much more autocratic, like Saudi Arabia, where power is very centralized. But there are places where it's even more centralized in Saudi Arabia, right? Whoever rules Saudi Arabia has a broader constituency that they have to engage. The royal family, some tribal dynamics, it's complicated, even though power is quite centralized. North Korea maybe is a kind of extreme example of even greater power centralization, right? Where a place where we're really talking about one person, although even that person, even the leader of North Korea, is somewhat accountable to a broader set of elites and has a broader constituency and would risk being toppled if they didn't. And then there's a whole spectrum of other forms of government, right? I mean, democracies, but even those vary dramatically. So what do we mean by governments and leaders? Even that is complicated. For Debs and Monteiro, they black box that, right? They want to talk about all governments as sort of the same, and as these entities that we can treat as functionally the same, but it's not clear that that's actually an appropriate assumption. Insecurity, right? What does it mean to be insecure? Can I look at Saudi Arabia and say, aha, on my 1 to 10 insecurity scale, Saudi Arabia is a 7. And here's why, right? Sure, I could do that analysis. But insecurity, maybe it's objective, right? Maybe we could assess it from the outside. But there's a lot about it that's subjective, right? I mean, when you think about, well, really any country, but take Israel, say. So Israel has a tangible security situation that it faces, but there's also a lot of psychology, right? So much so that maybe the psychology swamps the objective stuff, right? There's a feeling of insecurity, and it's rooted in a very particular history. It's rooted in a particular founding of that country not that long ago. It's rooted in a narrative that grows out of that. And so insecurity, maybe it's objective, but maybe it's something that's much more much more subjective. Alternatives, right? What does it mean to have alternatives to nuclear weapons? Well, it means conventional military capabilities, it means alliances, it means lots of things, potentially. But what's sufficient, right? And why is it that Japan, a highly capable country that's arguably been felt at times certainly fairly insecure, doesn't have nuclear weapons today, and other countries, Pakistan, or well, choose your country, there are lots of countries that do have nuclear weapons, right? What is it that's a viable alternative? And obviously we can tell stories or quote or have theories about what the answer there is, but I just want you to think about that. Capability, what does it mean to have sufficient capability to develop nuclear weapons? It's not binary. We treat it that way sometimes, or we talk about it that way sometimes, but it's not like, well, you do and you don't. There's a real spectrum in terms of how wealthy and technologically sophisticated the countries that acquired nuclear weapons were. The outliers at one end of the spectrum are Pakistan and China. So Pakistan and China both acquired nuclear weapons at a time when their per capita GDP, which is one way that we characterize the development of countries, was extremely low relative to everyone else who had obtained nuclear weapons. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we have countries that are very highly developed and very wealthy, like the United States, and obviously also a number of others that have obtained nuclear weapons. So this is a spectrum, and how it interacts, and interaction is a really crucial thing in our analysis. How it interacts with these other factors is important to flag, right? Maybe if you're really, really, really insecure, like Pakistan, then you find a way to make it work, right? There's a famous quote from Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who launched Pakistan's nuclear weapons program, and he said a version of this multiple times, but we will eat leaves and grass, or sometimes one of those is left out, but basically we will go hungry if we have to get a nuclear weapon if India gets a nuclear weapon. That itself, there's this notion that countries get nuclear weapons in response to other countries, and we'll unpack that a little more. But that too, I think, is more complicated than the conventional narrative would suggest. I'm not going to spend much time on this, but I wanted to flag it for you. So I think right up front, it's important to ask the question, what are we trying to explain, right? What history do we have to draw on that we're trying to explain? And then we can turn the analytic lens forward and use those insights to try to predict what might happen in future and to try to shape it, obviously. So there's a number of countries, 10 in total, 9 listed on this screen, who have obtained nuclear weapons. So the country that's missing here is South Africa. South Africa is missing here because it doesn't possess nuclear weapons. It's the only country ever to have obtained nuclear weapons on its own and then given them up. And there are a couple more that we sometimes count in that. So we want to explain why these 9 or 10 states proliferated. And by the way, when I say proliferated here, I always mean got their own nuclear weapons, not spread nuclear weapons to others. Both of those are common uses of the word proliferate. So we want to explain this, but we don't just want to explain this, because if we just focused on this, we would be focusing on, we would be picking cases, only cases that had failed or that had proliferated. And analytically, that's very suspect. So we also need to explain all the countries that didn't proliferate. And in the middle, so first off, there are 4 countries that we often talk about as giving up nuclear weapons, obviously South Africa, and then often we talk about Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus, the 4 post-Soviet states that inherited or had on their soil Soviet nuclear weapons when the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s. We talk about them as having possessed and given up nuclear weapons. That's not quite right. Actually, none of them had operational control. As with everything, there's lots of nuances to that story, but they did make a decision after lengthy international negotiations, each to give up and return or send to Russia the nuclear weapons on their soil. How much of a choice they had is a really interesting question. That's one among other things we could talk more about. But then there's a whole bunch of countries that in various ways pursued nuclear weapons. When I say explored and pursued here, pursued, I mean an actual nuclear weapons program, and explored, I mean activities short of that, but beyond doing nothing. And that doesn't sound very satisfying, and we don't need to go deeply into this, but there are some countries that opened the door to a possible nuclear weapons program without going very far down that path. Sweden, for example, is kind of at the low end of what you might call exploring, basically didn't want to close the door, but didn't do very much to walk down the path of pursuing nuclear weapons, and other countries have had very active nuclear weapons programs that didn't, or at least so far, haven't generated nuclear weapons. And I would count Iran in that, but I would also count Saddam Hussein's Iraq and a number of others. So we also want to explain this. One fundamental way to think about answers to this question of why do and don't states proliferate is to separate motivations and capabilities, right? States have motivations for why they want nuclear weapons, and states have capabilities that they bring to the table that make them more or less capable of obtaining nuclear weapons. And both of these are important, and they interact, and they're at least somewhat related, right? If you really, really, really want nuclear weapons, you can do things to bolster your capability. A signal example of that is Pakistan. Pakistan had relatively little nuclear capability early in the nuclear age before it launched a nuclear weapons program. Unlike India, actually, when India was much more deeply invested in a civil nuclear weapons program. So Pakistan had to build up a lot of its capability. And conversely, if you have a lot of capability, that might lower the bar in terms of how much demand you need to go to nuclear weapons, right? If you are Japan, if you have a highly, highly advanced civil nuclear program and you're technologically very sophisticated and you're very wealthy, maybe, now maybe not, and it's complicated, as all these things are, but maybe that lowers the bar for how readily you pursue nuclear weapons. Analytically, I think it's really useful to disaggregate these and then to constantly come back to thinking about how you can blend them. So the first answer to this question of why do and don't states proliferate was what we sometimes call technological determinism. And it just means if you can, you do. And this is often how we think about conventional weapons proliferation otherwise, right? The spread of other kinds of technologies like the tank, or military aircraft, or all kinds of weapon systems that you might think of, right? That states who are able to obtain these do. Now that's obviously complicated and depends on their particular security situation and otherwise. But early in the nuclear age, there's this sense of, wow, those who can do, and the list of those who can is growing, right? So you have President Kennedy, for example, famously talked about this fear that lots more states would have nuclear weapons. And these kinds of fears were central to the negotiation of the NPT. Sometimes we talk about this as the nth country problem. So who's next, right? There's always another country that could get nuclear weapons, and there's the sense of a runaway cascade of one state and then another state and then another state. And that basic story fits pretty well, actually, the proliferation patterns very early in the nuclear age. You have a pretty small number of countries who have the capability and those who can do. But then at some point it doesn't fit the history very well anymore. There's this kind of disjuncture, and that disjuncture lines up really nicely with the negotiation of the NPT. So one answer to why is, well, the NPT got negotiated, and depending on your theory of nuclear proliferation, maybe it's central, maybe it's secondary, maybe it's epiphenomenal. In other words, maybe something else is actually going on, like power politics, and the NPT is a kind of a secondary manifestation of that rather than the central causal thing that's changing that. But something changed, right? So that simplistic early answer to the question doesn't really apply. And in the proliferation literature, there are a variety of motivational factors, and these are not totally unrelated to the capability side, but there are a variety of motivational factors that we talk about and talk about interacting. Security is the most kind of fundamental one that that analysts tend to focus on, and often it's security and. So it's security and internal political dynamics. It's security and its interaction with the normative environment, right? It's security and its interaction with the institutional environment, which is related to, but not the same thing as the normative environment. But security is usually a part of the story, but it in very, very differing ways. So the literature has kind of unpacked these different ways of thinking about motivations. And then recently in the literature, there's been a kind of a return to the supply side. So a focus back on how capable are countries, and in particular, a focus on suppliers. So it is often said that no one proliferated alone, and that's true of every country that has obtained nuclear weapons. No one did it alone. The US was the first, obviously, but drawing quite heavily on refugees from, including people who had fled the Nazi regime, who aided the US nuclear weapons program. So, and the US nuclear weapons program, as you're almost certainly aware, was actually a multinational program, right? The Manhattan program was a joint US, UK, and often forgotten actually, Canadian program. It was a 3-country program. So the US did not proliferate alone, and no one after that did. The Soviet Union got intelligence insights unwillingly from the United States, deep insights into the US nuclear weapons program. The Chinese got quite considerable assistance early on in their program from the Soviets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the supply side, willing and unwilling, has gotten a lot of analytic attention again recently. So I'm going to skim over some of this a little bit, and I apologize that you have a lot of text on your screen. But the most fundamental argument for why states do and don't pursue nuclear weapons is rooted in security, insecurity or security. And the most basic argument that people make is that a state with which a particular state is in a rivalry, like Saudi Arabia and Iran, for example, is pursuing, has acquired, or maybe even is threatening nuclear weapons against another state. And this is sort of our shorthand often for how we talk about proliferation, right? If Iran gets a nuclear weapon, Saudi Arabia is likely to. North Korea has a nuclear weapon in response to US nuclear weapons capabilities. By the way, I want to problematize all of those. Like at a minimum, those are more complicated. You know, Pakistan pursued nuclear weapons in response to India. India pursued nuclear weapons in response to China, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So you can sort of tell this story of the nuclear age that's fundamentally rooted in this sort of dynamic of nuclear insecurity. And there's some support for it, at least at the sort of superficial level. once you dive into the kind of nuances of particular countries' decisions, at a minimum, this becomes more complicated. And it does raise the question of a whole bunch of countries that didn't themselves get, and in some cases didn't even pursue very seriously or at all nuclear weapons, who faced quite considerable nuclear threats. So always lots more nuances here. Another version of this is more broadly looking at security, and in particular conventional military insecurity. And kind of signal cases of this would be both Israel and Pakistan, countries that were not so much nuclear insecure, though the nuclear capabilities of others were not totally irrelevant, but they were just insecure, and in particular as a function of their conventional military capabilities, and that saw nuclear weapons as a kind of asymmetric response to that conventional insecurity. But one really important thing that the security arguments raise is, well, what are appropriate or sufficient substitutes for nuclear proliferation, right? Like, what if Iran goes nuclear? Is there anything we could offer Saudi Arabia? This is very simple or simplistic, but is there anything we could offer Saudi Arabia that might serve as a sufficient alternative to nuclear weapons, even if Iran went nuclear, right? Really robust conventional military capabilities. Or what if Saudi Arabia had really capable chemical and biological capabilities, right? Would those be a sufficient substitute? And one thing I want to flag for you here is it doesn't matter so much what rationally Saudi Arabia should view as a sufficient substitute, right? You could make the argument that you don't actually need nuclear weapons to counter nuclear weapons threats from others. Like, North Korea doesn't actually need nuclear weapons to counter US nuclear threats, and it can counter those in other ways. And in some respects, actually, North Korea having nuclear weapons puts a nuclear target on it in a way that actually decreases its security. That's a very logical, rational argument. But what matters is what North Korean policymakers believe. So if they believe they need nuclear weapons to counter US nuclear weapons, that's what matters, right? Because that's what they're going to act on. So I just want to flag that for you, because that's a really important caveat to rationalist models of international politics. It doesn't matter so much what states should believe, or really what individual leaders should believe. It matters what they do believe. And so that's a really important nuance here. And then the other thing I just want to flag for you is alliances have an interesting relationship with security. So an alliance can provide security, but so we have this notion that the US alliance to Japan provides Japan with a lot of security, and that makes it less likely that Japan will want its own nuclear weapons. So there are voices in Japan that do advocate for Japan to get its own nuclear weapons. But it's not just a provision of security, it's actually, Japan is actually vulnerable to the United States and open to pressure from the United States to not proliferate. And the US has done a lot of that over the years. It's giving Japan this level of heightened security, but then it's also using that to coerce it. And the broader relationship, and a great example of this is the nuclear weapons program, not as advanced as some, but I would call it a real nuclear weapons program in the 70s in South Korea, where the US did this really interesting, there was this interesting dynamic where the South Koreans felt insecure as the US was retrenching its alliance commitments in the region broadly, and to include with reference to South Korea. And so the South Koreans launched a nuclear weapons program, both to hedge their bets if the US abandoned them, but also to coerce the US to strengthen its alliance guarantee. And the US, it was this interesting dance where both sides didn't want South Korea to have nuclear weapons, and yet that was on the table as a kind of a bargaining tactic. And so the US offered South Korea strengthened alliance guarantees, but it also coerced South Korea with those and with the threat of a broader rift in the political and economic relationship. So lots of nuances here. I'm gonna, and then, think about what the cases are that are best described by these arguments. And I think some degree of the security argument shows up in all the cases, rightly, but in very different ways in different cases. I'm gonna skip over this because I've already flagged the things that I think are important, and I wanna move on to the next set of arguments. Ideas, norms, and status. So depending on your view of international politics, ideas can be central, like how we think about the nature of international politics shapes international politics. Simple example, slavery used to be widely considered to be legitimate and was a central part of international politics, and it is widely, with some key exceptions, sadly, but it is widely today considered to be illegitimate, and that actually changes how we act, right? So ideas have different norms, these ideas that govern shared ideas that govern human conduct actually shape international politics. That's one version of ideas, and scholars who focus on ideas, many of them are in what we would call the constructivist school of international relations. And there are other people who think ideas are secondary or epiphenomenal, that there are other things going on, like underlying power dynamics, and ideas are not central, maybe even just window dressing, right? Norms, for example, are just window dressing for underlying power dynamics. The US gets its way in international politics, and norms are these things that kind of give it legitimacy maybe, but aren't the real thing that's driving the behavior. So what kinds of ideas matter here? You know, actually, interestingly, ideas can play two different fundamental roles. There are obviously powerful norms against nuclear weapons proliferation, though in the nuclear domain, really interesting because you have a number of states that possess nuclear weapons, and so you have an attempt to create a normative architecture where it's illegitimate for others to pursue them, and it's yet somehow legitimate for those 9 states to have them, or at least those 5 states that in the NPT are acknowledged as nuclear weapons possessors. So there's this interesting stigma, but it's sort of caveated, but then obviously also not, right? There are powerful normative constraints on nuclear weapons broadly that apply also to the nuclear weapons possessors. And there is a global movement that in theory, at least, almost everyone buys into to varying degrees, to eliminate nuclear weapons. And there's a powerful normative stigma associated with nuclear weapons. But conversely, there are also some ideas that are on the other side, right? There is great pride associated with, and there certainly has been historically, with the accomplishment of having gotten nuclear weapons. India and Pakistan are great examples of this. When India and Pakistan so India for the second time and Pakistan for the first time in the late 1990s tested nuclear weapons, there were huge parties in the streets because they their citizenry felt deeply proud of this accomplishment, in particular in the kind of post-colonial context, right? India and Pakistan are countries that, as a result of their history, have this sense that they were mistreated. Rightly so, they were very, very mistreated, and nuclear weapons were a kind of an anti-colonial finger to the rest of the world. They were a way of telling off and showing the rest of the world what these countries that were treated as second-tier countries were able to accomplish. So there's a positive norm around nuclear weapons too, around the power of them, around the supposed sophistication of them and the accomplishment of having gotten them. And then there's another little wrinkle I want to just draw your attention to very briefly, which is going to look bizarre to you, presumably, as text, which is nuclear weapons as fetish objects. What's that? So that's a concept that's drawn from anthropology, and a fetish object is a thing to which value is assigned independent of its functional capabilities. And the fundamental example of this is money, right? Money is just paper or electrons if you have electronic banking. And yet, as human beings, we assign it a value and we treat it as though materially it's very meaningful. You don't casually hand out the money in your wallet, I'm assuming, and because it actually has a lot of value, but it's totally arbitrary. And Anne Harrington has done some really interesting work on nuclear weapons as fetish objects. In other words, as things to which we assign value somewhat independent of their actual physical capabilities. Obviously, you can not believe in nuclear weapons, and if they go off, they will hurt you. But arguably, we have constructed an elaborate intellectual architecture around nuclear weapons that is somewhat divorced from their actual capability. We treat them as these almost like totems, right? These symbolic things that have immense power that's only somewhat related to their ability to obliterate cities or kill a lot of people or obliterate military capabilities. So I just want to flag that for you because I think it's a really interesting argument. Again, I'll skip over this because I've already touched on the things I want to. Norms and institutions are related. I mean, sorry. Yeah, so let me jump over this and jump to, okay, so what I wanted to say about institutions, actually, sorry, I think my slides got scrambled there. So institutions, right, things like the International Atomic Energy Agency or the UN are, they can be norm creating, they can be norm reinforcing, norms can matter in that context, but institutions don't only matter because of norms. In fact, you could make an argument of institutions that had very little to do with norms. So one, depending on your view of international politics and of institutions, they might play various roles. And so for a liberal, or for someone in the, so realism, liberalism, and constructivism are these three sort of ways of viewing international politics. And for a liberal, it's much less about norms. The norms show up. And it's much more about, for example, ways in which institutions can ameliorate the dilemmas that are present in their absence. In other words, maybe like the prisoner's dilemma, right? The prisoner's dilemma is, we can't cooperate because I don't know your intentions and you don't know mine. So you're going to assume that I'm going to cheat, and I'm going to assume that you're going to cheat. And so we're both going to do something that together is suboptimal for both of us. Right? I think you're going to pursue nuclear weapons. You think I'm going to pursue nuclear weapons. We both pursue nuclear weapons. We both spend a lot of money, and we both end up with nuclear weapons, and arguably we're both less secure. And for a liberal, a lot of the role of an institution, for example, is, what if we could talk? And what if we could make commitments in a credible way, right? If I could say, I promise I won't get nuclear weapons, and please inspect my country, and you could do the same thing, maybe that would make it unnecessary for both of us to pursue nuclear weapons, and we'd both be better off. And that is one of the fundamental logics of the NPT, right? Is there's this system where countries can reassure each other, not perfectly, but sufficiently, maybe, in many cases, that it actually changes their behavior. So there are lots of reasons that institutions might matter, but I think that's a good fundamental one to flag, and norms may be part of it, right? The NPT reinforces and in some respects maybe even created the anti-proliferation norm, but there are also very functional ways in which the NPT, the IAEA, and other institutions might matter. I'm going to flag just briefly a couple things for you. There's this democratic peace argument, right? That democracies don't go to war with each other, and there's a lot of empirical support for that. There's actually either no exceptions to that, or maybe a few very modest exceptions. A version of this, by the way, which is now disproved, is no two countries with McDonald's in them go to war with each other. The Clinton administration bombing in the former Yugoslavia that falsified that, but that was true, I think, until then. But democracies do seem to be different in an important way, which is that they honor their commitments. And there's a lively debate about why that is, and therefore how robust it is. But when democracies commit not to proliferate, they don't cheat. And non-democracy, so we have a number of examples of countries explicitly cheating on their NPT commitments. Iraq is a good example. And democracies do not seem to engage in this behavior. There's a political scientist called Edel Solingen who focuses on ruling coalitions, so groups of people, and that might be a person with a highly centralized power structure around them, or it might be a democracy where a particular party holds power. Ruling coalitions may have very different strategies for staying in power, for regime survival, and those strategies, she argues, have big effects on the pros and cons that they see when it comes to nuclear weapons proliferation. For her, two examples of this are North Korea, a very inward-looking a ruling coalition with a very inward-looking regime survival strategy. And by the way, this distinction between regime survival and national survival is really important. The simplest realist argument focuses on national survival, right? The United States wishes to survive, therefore it does X. But a more nuanced version of that is there's some people in power who, it's not just they want the country to survive, but it's that they want to stay in power. And that looks a little different, and that interacts with nuclear proliferation motivations and lots of other things in really interesting ways. But she argues North Korean regime has particular incentives that shape its proliferation behavior, versus South Korea with a very different strategy for the country and for whoever's in power that really shapes their proliferation motivations. Organizations are really important, and can play interesting roles, and whether they're central or not depends a little bit obviously on how you view international politics and the nature of countries. And then individuals can be really important in different ways. I just want to flag for you, individuals and organizations always matter, in the sense that they are what you might call a transmission belt for all the other stuff, or a filter for all the other stuff, right? So maybe you think nuclear weapons proliferation is fundamentally about security and insecurity. Fine. But imagine that you had a national leader who didn't know that they were militarily threatened, or who was delusional, or unable to process that. They wouldn't then act in a way that reflected that insecurity, even if it was very real. In other words, the people in power matter, and how much they matter is disputed, to the point where some people black box them, right? It doesn't much matter who's in power. Anyone facing the same constraints would act in this way. Or, you know, they matter a lot. So someone like Jacques Hymans has argued that they're actually central. Their particular psychological baggage is central, and really answers the question of who's likely to proliferate and who's not. Whereas others would argue it's totally epiphenomenoal, and then there's a whole spectrum. I see just popping up that I have at least 2 questions. So that's interesting. They pop up for me, but when I'm not doing my full screen, I can't actually access them. Let me just glance at them. No, I have no box to access them when I'm screen sharing. Strange. Well, 2 of you have apparently written comments to me, but I can't see them until I stop screen sharing. So let me, I think if they're important, I think I'll let Jean pipe in, but otherwise let me maybe move on, just because I'm mindful of time. And then just briefly, so I've focused a lot on motivations. Just recently, there's been this kind of turn in the literature, which has focused back on the supply side. And I mentioned already this insight that no one has ever proliferated alone, that everyone got some kind of assistance, and that includes civil nuclear assistance, right? So things we sometimes colloquially call Atoms for Peace, and obviously there's an actual Atoms for Peace program where we, the United States, in partnership with others, disseminated civil nuclear technology, and many people think that that was problematic, and that helped some countries to get non-civil technology, weapons technology. And then there's sensitive nuclear assistance, right? There are lots of countries that have explicitly gotten from other countries assistance with the sensitive parts of weapons programs. For example, France provided pretty striking assistance to Israel in its nuclear weapons program, and that's a really fascinating story if you want to delve into that more deeply. But everyone got some forms of assistance, but in some cases unwilling. So I mentioned the Soviet Union spied on the Manhattan Project, and that aided, though there's some debate about how crucial it was, that aided the Soviet program when the Soviet Union was the 2nd country after the US to proliferate. And then there's some other nuances that I think, in the interest of time, I will skip over. There are a couple terms I just want to mention. One is ambiguity or uncertainty. Nuclear weapons are a thing about which states have a lot of incentives to be secretive. And so this is a real challenge for us as analysts, and it's a particular challenge in the present and therefore looking into the future, right? Who knows what's happening in Saudi Arabia right now when it comes to nuclear weapons proliferation. And history suggests, you know, we don't know what we don't know, but history suggests that we actually have a remarkable amount of insight into what countries have done in the past, and maybe even what they're doing right now. And there are lots of reasons for that, including civil society, including international safeguards. But I actually, personally, I would say I feel like I have a lot of insight into what's happening in Saudi Arabia right now, at least sort of concretely or tangibly. Who knows what conversations the leadership is having? We can speculate about that, but that's not very public. But, you know, does Saudi Arabia have a huge hidden complex of uranium enrichment plants? I really, really doubt it, actually. And, you know, that's an interesting thing to talk about more if you're interested in it. But I think we actually do have a lot of insight. Hedging. So it's not binary. It's not like countries pursue nuclear weapons or they don't. Some countries hedge their bets. Interesting example of this, India did not so much make a decision to get nuclear weapons as it made a decision to build a capability to later choose to get nuclear weapons should it later choose to do that. So it did it in a way that was sort of an on and off kind of nuclear weapons program, and at times the political leadership was looped into that and at times it wasn't. And lots of interesting nuances there, but countries hedge. And you might actually argue that Iran doesn't have or hasn't had in recent years so much a nuclear weapons program as a nuclear weapons option program, as a kind of a hedging program. And so that's a really important caveat. Ambivalence. India is a great example of this. India wasn't sure for a considerable period of time whether it wanted actual nuclear weapons. And so there's this kind of ebb and flow in the Indian program that's really remarkable, where this is a little simplistic, but where the leaders kind of can't make up their mind about whether they want nuclear weapons or not, and the scientific establishment ends up moving forward a lot to bolster India's capabilities, but there's this real kind of deep-seated ambivalence for periods of time. And then latency. Latency is the unrealized capability to, in this case, pursue successfully nuclear weapons. And latency might be intentional, and when it is, we call it hedging. Like, I want to build up my capability if I choose to exercise it later. Or it might be unintentional, right? It might be just, I want to have a really robust civil nuclear weapons program for power, say, or medicine, and other uses. And as a function of that, I get nuclear weapons related capability, but I'm not doing it for nuclear weapons reasons. And you might argue that in Japan, a lot of the nuclear weapons related capability Japan has is a function of latency more than hedging, though probably a little bit of both in the Japanese case. And then all these factors interact, right? If you're really, 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 really insecure, maybe it trumps a lot of other factors. Maybe it just doesn't matter very much whether you're a democracy or autocracy or how capable you are, et cetera, maybe. But even if you're really, really insecure, probably the strategies you choose really depend on other things, right? What you do when you're Japan and you're really, really insecure may look very different than what you do when you're Pakistan. And lots of other nuances here, which I will jump over. And then just, this is the final thing I think is really important to flag for you, which is, depending on which of these arguments you think is central, the prescription for what we should do to stop proliferation changes a lot, right? If it's all about security or insecurity, there are things we can do to affect that, like alliances, like providing people conventional military capabilities, like negotiating and ameliorating antagonistic relationships, right? I mean, maybe if we had been able to broker a more pacific relationship between India and Pakistan, they would never have felt the need to get nuclear weapons. Now, that's really hard, and maybe that's a long-term prescription rather than a short-term prescription, but that's really important, right? We shouldn't just talk about conventional military capabilities and alliances that provide security, but we should talk about, you know, in some respects, if you're committed to non-proliferation and disarmament, it's really more broadly peace and security that you're making a commitment to, and that in some respects is your most powerful long-term non-proliferation tool, arguably, right? Again, it depends on how you view proliferation motivations. Ideas, norms, and status, right? We can shape, to some extent, the normative environment, but it also matters how we act. The fact that 5 countries are authorized to possess nuclear weapons kind of cramps our style when we're making these normative arguments. Not wholly, and again, it depends on your view of international politics, but we have the ability to shape that normative environment. We have a lot of ability to build institutions. Depending on your view of international politics, maybe we're wasting our time, but there are a lot of ways in which we can build them and strengthen them that many people think are really crucial. Domestic politics, we have a lot less ability to shape domestic politics than we do to shape other things, but we have some. Right? And we're not very good at it, we, the United States, but we, the international community as well. But we do have some ability to shape domestic politics in other countries, including by these other factors. But that's a more, if it's mostly about domestic politics, we have less leverage. Same thing for individuals. We have a lot of ability to shape the supply side. And that's what we do, right? That's what export controls are. That's what, to some extent, safeguards are. There's a lot we do to try to shape countries' ability to do this and to interfere with countries who are actually doing this when they do this. And we're sort of good at this, and there are lots of examples of how we're terrible at this as well. And then obviously there's some idiosyncratic individual cases. This is a picture, by the way, of A.Q. Khan, the father of the Pakistani bomb, a term he likes, but which is almost certainly overblown, but he played a crucial role in Pakistan's nuclear weapons program. So I just want you, in closing, and then I want to glance at the questions I haven't been able to see. I just want you to think about, what is your theory of proliferation? So what's your assessment of the crucial factors? What story do you tell if I ask you to explain to me why some country proliferated or why some country might proliferate in future? And how is that similar to or different from how others think about that? And what arguments do you find particularly compelling or uncompelling, or they don't make much sense to you? And again, I want to nudge you not to just say it all matters. Of course it all matters, but some things are more important than others, and that's the nature of doing this kind of analysis, is to say, these things are particularly crucial. I have for you identified a bunch of additional resources that I think are particularly interesting. I won't touch on them now because I want to go to Q&A, and or maybe Jean wants to jump in as well. But again, I'm assuming you'll have either a recording or the slides afterward, and I am happy if my slides are shared with you. So with that, let me check in with Jean, and I'm going to stop screen sharing and look at what you posted in the comments while I was speaking to you.
Thank you, Philip. While you look at that, do you wish to address some of the questions, or should I give my intervention first and then we go to the questions?
Yeah, so I am happy to go with your preference, but it maybe I can briefly glance at them. So it looks like there are 7 in the chat. So is the fact that Saudi Arabia has nuclear weapons? I didn't totally follow that. So Saudi Arabia doesn't have nuclear weapons. And I was using that as an example of a country that might. Many people think it's high on the risk list. And I wanted us to think about, in future, why it might. And I think the Iranian relationship is really crucial. So for me, my story of what makes Saudi Arabia a greater or lesser risk has a lot to do with Iran. And one thing I want you to flag for you here is the Iranian-Saudi relationship is the tension is somewhat militarized, but it's actually more ideological and normative, and it's a different kind of, it also has a military component, but it's not just military. And prestige matters a lot. And the prestige of Iran having nuclear weapons and Saudi Arabia not, I think would probably be quite important. So that's a way in which a constructivist might think about that issue. Rodrigo Ureta's question is, with respect to nuclear weapons acquisition, what are the main consequences of recent US-Iran tensions? Great question. And how would these affect disarmament efforts in the Middle East more broadly, and Israel not being a party to the NPT? And then there's a separate question about nuclear terrorism. Great questions. I really can't do them justice here. I guess my personal view is that the Iran nuclear deal was really important in terms of constraining. I served in the Obama administration, but I don't like the way Obama talked about it as eliminating Iran's ability to get nuclear weapons. I don't think that's right. I would say postponing or curtailing Iran's ability to get nuclear weapons for a very meaningful period of time in a very meaningful way. And I think the way in which this administration has undercut that, I think, is deeply problematic. And the way in which this administration has not been able to build on that in a way that ameliorates some of the tensions in the US-Iran relationship is problematic. And I personally think that it heightens the danger that Iran gets nuclear weapons in future. Middle East nuclear weapons free zone, fascinating issue, and really, Middle East WMD free zone efforts that link not only Israel's nuclear weapons, but also Egypt's chemical weapons capability, Syria's former, or at least mostly former, chemical weapons capability. That is a perfect example of a thing that people with different theories of nuclear weapons proliferation and international politics more broadly could think about very differently, right? For some people, Middle East WMD free zone negotiations are a complete waste of time because that's not how international politics works. And for some people, they're central, and then there's a whole spectrum. So think about where you fall on that spectrum and why, what your theory of how international politics and nuclear weapons proliferation is, and therefore what you think about those negotiations. terrorist groups acquiring nuclear weapons, you know, there are two questions here. One is, are there any terrorist groups that actually could acquire nuclear weapons? And I think that's a really important part of the answer. And thankfully, I would say the answer is mostly no, but it is not inconceivable that a highly motivated, highly capable group could do that. And I think those groups, you know, if they could, they would. So in some respects, the motivational dynamic is less interesting. If you think about Al-Qaeda or ISIS, these groups that have kind of quasi-national or transnational aspirations, they, you know, I think they would be highly motivated to get nuclear weapons. There's an interesting wrinkle there, which is if they did, would they use them? And probably, but that's worth thinking about too. You know, Jean, I'm happy to keep going through the questions, and I'm also happy, you know, to let you be the judge of when you want to jump in. So, you know, I'll sort of, I guess I'll briefly pause there and see if you want to jump in, but it looks like I've got a couple more questions if you want me to take them. So, okay, so I have a question. Do you think the acceptance of nuclear powers like India, Pakistan, and Israel, as well as difference in treatment in comparison countries is an incentive? Yeah, so how we treat countries sets an example for other countries. And a really great example of that is Libya, right? So Gaddafi had this interesting about face where he had these pretty rudimentary nuclear weapons program and more robust, a little more robust biological and somewhat more robust chemical weapons efforts. And he negotiated with the international community, in particular the UK and the United States, to really change his relationship with the international community and give up those capabilities. And soon after that, he was overthrown, in part with the support of, in particular, the United States. And so how we treat countries, other countries are definitely watching. And the current example of that is Iran, right? The Iran nuclear deal, North Korea is watching that. And the deal we made and then the way in which we abrogated it, the United States stepped out of it, is definitely sets a precedent for others. You know, how central that is open to discussion. And some analysts would tell you countries are much more focused on their individual situations and the costs and benefits they perceive themselves as facing. And this notion that we talk about so much, that reputation is central, that they focus so much on how we treat others is overblown. Some analysts would tell you that. And other analysts would tell you that reputation matters a lot. And this is an interesting example where we should pay attention to what leaders actually say. And what leaders actually say is that reputation matters a lot, right? What they say is, I see how you're treating Iran and I care about it. And so even if rationally they should care less, which some people would argue, you know, we should pay attention to how they actually act. Which strategy is more effective, sanctions or isolation or diplomatic engagement? I think that's really hard to answer in the abstract. I think, you know, we have a toolkit, and I actually think they're not mutually exclusive. And one of the things that's interesting is that each tool has a flip side. So I'll give you a simple example. When I give you a carrot, an inducement, right? A carrot is a thing. So we talk about carrots and sticks. A stick I beat you with, so that's a threat, and a carrot is an inducement. I give you a thing you want. So say when we gave North Korea the possibility of a strengthened relationship with the international community and some tangible benefits like proliferation-resistant light water nuclear reactors as part of the 1994 agreed framework that we negotiated with them, we were giving them a thing they wanted. And what's interesting about carrots is that you can take them away again. So actually when you give someone something, then you give yourself some leverage to take it away again. Oh, you liked those nuclear reactors that we were building for you, but now we don't like your behavior, so we're going to stop building them. I'm not saying that's what happened, and that story is really complicated, but carrots entail sticks in the sense that you can take them away again, and sticks entail carrots in the sense that you can stop beating someone, right? You can sanction Iran, and then you can stop. And so there's this interesting two-part relationship where there's sort of two sides of the same coin. I think that's important to focus on. All right.